Hi everyone.
Thank you so much for coming along today. Yes, my name is Georgia Ward-Dyer. I am only very nominally a violinist. I'm an artist and researcher. And this is what I'm going to be talking to you about today, why artists should work with AI, but I thought I'd give a little bit of an introduction about myself before that. So although I suppose I would call myself a philosopher, but maybe sort of lapsed philosopher, because although I have a degree in philosophy, I found that exploring them through philosophy as an academic discipline I found it somewhat limiting, and so this is how I came to art practice. But I'm still interested in the same ideas that motivated me as a philosopher. So some ideas about the relationship between word and image, for instance. I'm interested in meaning, what meaning is, how it's constructed, where it's located, which in itself is a bit of a tricky word about locating meaning, how it dissolves, the sort of boundary between meaning and non-meaning. And because I'm interested in those things in my art practice, I'm then also interested in things like taxonomy and categorization and archives, but also folklore, magic and myth, so all these disparate things. That's what art practices are like, aren't they? But I've often worked with scientists and technologists, and in my creative practice I would make things, but I also write things. I am going to talk a tiny bit about some of my own work at the end, but I just wanted to give a bit of a background about what my sort of interests and motivations are. But for the past couple of years, I've also been working at Nesta, the Innovation Foundation. I work in the sort of think tank bit as a researcher, and I work there on emerging technologies in the arts, as well as some futures work. And I do that through some sort of more speculative research projects and workshops, but also research and policy work for government, public bodies like the Arts Council and so on. So just before I start, a quick note about diversity. Firstly, when I talk about artists, why should artists make work with AI? I mean this in the broadest sense of one who works through creative practice. I don't want to get caught up in labels about specific practitioners, so all welcome. And secondly, acknowledging my own privileges as white, highly educated from, privileged socioeconomic background. I don't think it's possible to overstate how important it is to have a diversity of who these artists are. When I say artists should be working with AI, I don't have a narrow view of what those artists should look like. And I don't just mean diversity in the sort of race, gender, identity, sexual orientation way, but in the wider sense of diversity of viewpoints and disciplines, lived experience, and so on. So with this in mind, and knowing that I hope that the audience that you're making up today is a mix of different backgrounds, and some of you I'm sure lots of you from UAL, but also perhaps some members of the general public too. I've worked hard to make this talk as accessible and in plain English, and so I'll try to stick to that. And of course, I'll be happy to come back to anything that isn't clear. We've got the Q&A later, we've got a break later as well, when you're very welcome to come and chat to me. So today, I'm going to talk about why artists should make work with AI. The short answer to this is because it's a valuable thing to do. But what is the value and who is it valuable for? So I'm going to unpack this, and I'm going to roughly divide my time talking. I'm a bit confused now about the time because we started a bit late, didn't we? Do I have until about 2? We started? Yeah? Okay, I'll try and stick to that. So who is it valuable for? Where's the value? So dividing it in two, I'll be looking at it on the one hand as valuable to everyone, to the general public, to AI researchers, to the sort of wider picture. And then in the second half, I'll be talking about the value to artists themselves of working with AI. So another way to think about this is sort of my first question, why artists should work with AI. In the first part, I'll look at why artists should work with AI, why the fact that it's artists doing this work is important. And then I'll be looking at why artists should work with AI, so why for artists it's important to work with it. Hope that's clear between the two there. I was going to pretend this was a GIF, and then I thought you'd all see through that and know that I was the sort of mechanical Turk behind her. First we're looking at this one, aren't we? Why artists should work with AI. Why is that important? So there are a few different reasons. And this reads, when I wrote this down, I thought it reads a bit like a manifesto, actually. I don't have a problem with that. Manifestos are very important in art and across the history of art. So reading this out, so the world needs artists to challenge AI. I should put the emphasis right. The world needs artists to challenge AI. The world needs artists to make sense of AI. Artists are critical. Artists are good at complexity. Artists are ahead of the curve. So we're going to work through these. So obviously artists have always been early adopters of or experimenters with new technologies. But they're not sort of obedient users to use the parlance of tech companies, of users of technologies. Artists working with tools, which I'm going to slightly use interchangeably with the word technology, is a bit like anyone who's tried doing user testing with children, for instance, or user testing with not just your peers from your course, for instance. I don't use that analogy mildly if we think about tropes around children and creativity as well. About the sort of every child is an artist, Picasso stuff. Artists will use the tool, but they won't use it how they're supposed to, and they'll break it, and they'll break it 100 different ways, and they'll repurpose it, and they'll adapt it for some strange reason that they want. And artists have obviously always done this with technologies. And so again, as I was saying, thinking about technologies as tools, I was thinking about some example of the way that artists use tools or use technologies to give. And I thought a really simple one would be about paint, which has been around for ages and is quite a simple technology to get our head around. Been around, since I looked this up, and it's I think it's 27,000 years ago. So it's some nice figurative cave paintings from 27,000 years ago. But really, it's about how a tool as simple as paint gets changed and transmuted over time. So here's another. This is not a sort of linear progression through time, as you may have guessed. Here's Jackson Pollock. Not the first person to use paint in this way, but certainly the most famous. So it's challenging the sort of mechanism of the tool itself. That sounds very overwrought to say about paint, that it has a mechanism of use, but how you use paint can be challenged. Here's another example, just to work against just having sort of famous man Jackson Pollock. Here's Daphne Oram, who used paint to paint on film strips, which were then played through a special machine that she created to create electronic sound, so sort of electronic music machine using paint. I mean, these are slightly sort of idiosyncratic examples I've picked, but the idea is to show that, even something as simple as paint has a long, long history in how it's been used. And of course, how that Daphne Oram one is from 1957. Of course, there are even more exciting examples of how paint is used now, and it doesn't follow any kind of linear trajectory. It's just led through all these different revolutions. And artists are doing this with AI already, but it's important that more artists do this with AI too. And of course, we'll hear some examples of that today. But where are we on this timeline with AI as a tool rather than paint? Sorry. If this is the timeline for paint, where are we for those artists using AI? I wouldn't want to say we're at the beginning, because that would be rude to the artists who are here today, who've got amazing work that they've done with AI. But no doubt, one thing for sure that we can know is that however artists are using AI today, it'll be very different in 27,000 years' time. So I just think the idea of being at the beginning of this moment of exciting experimentation, and especially with a tool like AI where the pace of change is so much faster than the pace of change with paint that took, thousands of years for someone thought to put it in a tube. So, I'm not the only... I know I'm biased, but I'm not the only one who thinks that artists have an important contribution to make in terms of the developments of technologies. Douglas Egg, who's the project lead for a Google project called Magenta, whose aim is all about, experimenting with how machine learning can contribute to creating art and music, has talked about this and has talked about, has sort of drawn an analogy with the camera and has talked about how artists who are working with AI now, that's really the future of what it will look like, to making the tool as the first step. So there's going to be a trajectory, and we're really only at the beginning, and it's all the way through. I think it's artists who are going to mechanistically challenge those technologies. So challenge how they work, what they can be used for, how they're used. But there's another way in which artists challenge technologies, not just how they're used or what they do, but also the impact that they have. And this is just as important, maybe has sort of reached the public consciousness a bit more. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples of this. So artists mentioned here, so there's Caroline Sinders, who has a project called Feminist Dataset, and Joy Bulamwini, who has created this poem, performance, AI Ain't I a Woman. I've put these up with the names and everything to encourage you to look them up and get to know them. I couldn't do them justice in the time I've got today. But these are both these projects challenge this idea of algorithmic bias that probably a lot of you have come across, the idea of this, that because of the data that's used to train some algorithms, the advent of AI as a sort of integral part of how society is run could or does already amplify existing inequalities. Here's another example, just because it's very topical, because it's just from a few weeks ago. Kate Crawford from the AI Now Institute and artist Trevor Paglen did this ImageNet roulette, where you could upload a selfie of yourself and then be labelled by an AI image recognition tool trained on ImageNet, which is a very significant and sort of seminal data set of images. And the results were sort of, people were like, oh, this is really fun. What does the AI think I am? But it's quickly showed up a sort of problematic sides about, I'm quoting from this article now, a dark-skinned man was labelled as wrongdoer, offender, an Asian woman as a jihadist. So I think, again, this is about how artists, as I was saying before, like with the paint, yes, they sort of challenge the mechanism of how a tool works, but also they critically challenge what impact it has too. And so they work to make sense of what AI is for the public, and it's quite an important communication role. Bringing something which, even if it was in specific communities quite well known about, the idea of algorithmic bias didn't just appear 2 weeks ago, but certainly bring it to a wider public is really important. But so I just wanted to take a moment of pause and think, hang on, I was just talking about training sets. What is AI? I was just at a workshop the other day and it started with this, and let me tell you, we spent a large percentage of the day in agonies over trying to work out how to define AI. And this was a room full of, engineers, computer scientists, policy experts, people who knew the field. The data set that I was just talking about that was used in Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen's piece, this one, ImageNet, that was not assembled by an AI, that was assembled by people. So even if we were going to try and say, okay, well, forget all these confusing bits of training sets, let's just try and give a purely technical definition of what AI is. And this is what happened the other day in this workshop, and it was very funny to watch. You'd have people disagree completely on what that would be. There's the, it's just statistics crowd. There's the sort of, it's just about, it's an engineering problem. Even if you said, okay, well, can we agree it's a computer program? Well, what does that mean? Again, is it an algorithm? Which one? I mean, what do we mean by algorithm? Lines of computer code? Is it a neural network, the sort of catchphrase that people have got to know now? Or is it the weights of a network. I mean, it's a complete nightmare to try and unravel that. And I'm not suggesting we do, but I'm trying to make a point here about it being complicated. So even if we were to try and give a technical definition of what AI is, we couldn't. But we wouldn't want to do that anyway, because it would be a complete fallacy. As we've seen, AI is culturally embedded in at least the following ways that I've already gone through. If for instance, we think about AI as just, I think how maybe most people might think of it, that the thing which powers, I don't know, recommendation algorithms like Netflix, or transactions on Amazon, or assistants like Siri and Alexa, already that's hugely culturally embedded, especially as the success of those depends on the sort of having a successful relationship with the human interactions in order to improve as services. So there's not a clean divide between the technology and the culture anyway. On top of this, if this wasn't complicated enough, we also have, there's a project at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence called AI Narratives, which is a project about I suppose shedding light on what the public perceptions around AI are, and it's what you'd expect. It's sort of Terminator figures and sci-fi. But that question is not just important sort of anthropologically to think about, but also as a practical one when it comes to policy. AI is sort of well known as a field of research. This danger of overreaching on hype has a policy impact. If it doesn't deliver, and if you look at the sort of, you can find graphs of AI research progress and sort of peaks and troughs of AI winters. So it's a total mess, basically, is what I'm getting at. And now, obviously, I'd want to acknowledge that all technologies, and I'm sure you're all at UAL, you all know this already, all technologies are shaped and defined by culture and society, and by their use over time. That's not a new thought. Or one specific to AI, but I think it's particularly significant here, as I said, because of the particular nature of how AI, and particularly machine learning, which is what mostly people mean when they say AI these days anyway, how that works, and secondly, how potentially pervasive and diffuse AI applications will be. AI is the sort of paragon example of complexity around what a technology is, what its impact is, how it will be shaped by us. But art, as a creative practice, as a medium, as a sphere of influence, can handle that kind of complexity. If we think back to our paint example, there are different analogies I could use, but art practice and art practitioners sort of will flood the space, will fill the vacuum with all possible kinds of challenges and experiments, both at the individual level of an individual's art practice. As I was saying earlier about why I came to art rather than philosophy, it's an approach that allows for contradiction and allows for multivalence, allows for ambiguity and complexity. But also as a discipline and at the institutional level, where we are today, it allows for that kind of complexity too. So that's one of the things, in fact, particularly which digital technologies are good at enabling. So hopefully I've shown that AI is complex, but that art is very good at handling complexity, or artists are. So the last one on that list was about artists being ahead of the curve. So I don't want to jump the gun because we're going to hear examples of artists working with AI. But if we remember about how that pace of technological change is not some nice straight line, I just wanted to give an example. So here's a slide showing the performance of GANs between 2014 and 2018. So in the plain English version. So an AI tool which generates images of faces. On the left in the black and white is how well it did at generating realistic-looking faces in 2014, and on the right, how well it did in 2018. So that's an incredibly short time for a huge improvement. And there's an example from a project that Anna and I did together, actually, about this, about why artists are well-placed to both keep up with the pace of change, but also to document it. Anna and I worked on a project a couple of years ago in which we used as one of many steps, we used voice recognition software to as a step in creating a contemporary retelling of classic fairy tales, this one, Beauty and the Beast. And even involved us reading a sort of the classic version into a voice recognition algorithm for it to sort of transcribe what we were saying. And even a few months on from when we first did that project, the results were completely different because the API that had been released that we used had improved, its performance had improved dramatically. And we were intentionally exploiting the ways in which it got stuff wrong and misheard us. One, because of the aesthetic sort of result that we wanted, but also because it gave us an insight into, for example, what this tool was trained on. It turned out this one had lots of references to sort of anime characters and things, so we thought, okay, well, it's clearly trained on closed captioning. And just a few months later, none of that insight or aesthetic would have been available to us because it was quite seamless. So artists are the ones who are grabbing those moments, documenting them, maybe the only public documentation of those things. So that's enough about how great artists are, and I've got my eye on the time as well, but hopefully I can squeeze a bit more time in. We've done enough talking about how brilliant artists are. Now let's talk about, I'm addressing the artists and saying why you should work with AI. So I'm going to talk about two aspects of this. Firstly, a sort of race through, with an eye on the time again, the role of AI in the creative process. And then secondly, an idea of AI as mirror. So the role of AI in the creative process, I'm just going to really quickly move a step away from the idea of AI as creator, AI as original creator. I know that dominates the headlines, and if you are interested in that, there's plenty out there to sink your teeth into. But I think it's a distraction. Although there's really interesting research on this about computational creativity, there's the Goldsmith's computational creativity work, there's work before that, there's Margaret Bowden on this, so if you're interested in that. I think it's a distraction from what's really exciting at the moment, which is AI not as some sort of competing creator that's going to replace artists, but instead as a mediator that makes the creative process more seamless and intuitive. And I'm going to give some examples. So here's an example from Rebecca Fiebrink, who I just learned, I think, is joining CCI. Yes, great. Lucky you, is all I can say. So she created this tool called Wekinator, which, again, I've put the details up, so if you're interested to hear more, go off and look it up. It's brilliant, but essentially allows you to set what inputs you want to give and then what outputs you want to get using your laptop with no coding knowledge needed, and it's incredibly quick and intuitive to learn and very fun. She's made some other great tools as well, but it's fun, it's quick, it's accessible, it's flexible. And the way that you use it in your creative process, it's not like, oh no, now I've got to sit down and spend hours trying to install something on my laptop so that I can code with it. Another example of a tool, which I thought I should mention because there's been some noise about it in the sort of creative AI community, is Runway ML. So this is a project which is a similar intention to try and let people experiment with AI tools in quite a straightforward way without coding knowledge needed. I should mention, though, I think it's important to talk about this, that Runway ML is not free. It's free to download, but then you sort of spend, it's a credit system with computation time that you use. And this is really important to note about who creates and owns these tools, if they're going to be so important in the creative process. I think it could be this watershed moment, like with Adobe Creative Suite, where suddenly everyone can use Photoshop and everyone can be a graphic designer. But there is a tension with things that are proprietary and what artists want to do with it, which is, experiment. And I think it's not just even about a software question, because with machine learning particularly, it also becomes a hardware question. Even if, a TensorFlow is free to use, then you still need GPUs to run it. So it gets quite knotty. And I think we should be focusing on the importance of creating conditions in which in which using these is accessible to everyone. And obviously, when I say accessible, it's not just about the financial access or the resource access if you've got the hardware or whatever. It's also about skills. But I don't really need to say much about that because here we are at CCI. So I think we're good on that front, I'll say. But yeah, it's not just about there being tutorials online with skills. It's also about having community spaces that support people to learn. So they're two important things to mention. So there is this possible characterization of the role of AI as one which supports and helps the creative process. But there's also another one, AI not as creator, not even as mediator, but as disruptor, which is an annoying word to use. But this is the idea that actually AI could help take creative practice in unexpected directions. So obviously the history of using rules and algorithms in the creative process is a long one. There's a long history of computing and computer arts, and even before, even without computers, just artists using rules in their process, like surrealists or Oulipo all use this. So it's not a new idea. So do we put AI on the sort of continuum of that, or do we think of it as doing something a bit more, maybe there's a bit different or even more exciting? And I'm running out of time, so I'll go to this very quick example of generative design, which is sort of the idea of turning the design process on its head and not saying, oh, I need to design a chair. Okay, well, we'll have to have 4 legs, and okay, well, here's what chairs used to look like. How can we change this a bit and improve it? Instead, it's okay, I need to design a chair. I'm going to describe what the design problem is. It's something that can support the weight of a person and that's got a sort of flattish bit, bottom-shaped bit on the top. And then you hand that to the AI, and then it explores all the possible solutions and comes back with something really wacky and weird that a person probably wouldn't have thought of by themselves. So I think, the sort of idea of AI not only as potentially having a big impact in improving or making more intuitive an existing creative process, but also interacting with the creative process more like a collaborator would, rather than a sort of obedient slave. Now, very finally then, AI as a mirror. I'll probably have to skip a few bits here. Hopefully I've done enough to convey to you the idea that AI is very tightly intertwined with ourselves, us as individuals, but also us sort of civically as a society. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my own practice too. So one example from my practice about how intertwined AI is with ourselves, and then how we can exploit this to make work that is a reflection of ourselves, is a poetry collection that I created, asking people to generate text using the predictive software on their phones. So, you just sort of tap the letters, the words that come up, and then you can generate reams of text. And obviously what came back, yes, of course, it gave insights about the technology itself, but it really gave very intimate insights about, I hope you can, it's big enough to read, isn't it? Gave really intimate insights about the people who'd contributed text, what their pet names were for their loved ones, how much they hated their boss, where they were going away on holiday, all of this really intimate information. So, already, if you're a part of the modern world, there's a sort of algorithmic versions of you fractured across all the services that you use. And there are other artists who've looked at this, of course. I would name check Erica Scorty, who's worked on this, and who sort of puts it best, saying, everyone's producing an image of themselves for an algorithmic gaze, intentionally or not. So even if you're not particularly interested in making work about AI, as a tool to start thinking about our identity and how it's made up of our communication or our personalities is really interesting. And I'd really like to make that quite clear. Making work with AI doesn't always have to have the technology itself as a subject matter. And I'm sure Anna will touch on that as well later. So lastly, in my own practice, there's another way in which AI is a great tool in this way, not to talk about AI itself, but as a sort of reflection back on a human way of doing things. I wanted to make another point, if I haven't rammed the point home enough already, about AI being a reflection of ourselves individually and ourselves in society and culturally. Also, in terms of how some AI tools were developed, there's a direct link, between a scientist called Jan LeCun, who created a very important kind of AI tool, created, I'm giving him a lot of credit here, but convolutional neural networks, has talked about how he's influenced by the structure of the human brain in terms of designing the structure of these kinds of neural networks. So there's a literal link between how we are and how AI, some kinds of AI are. And I've been interested in this in my practice to explore philosophical ideas about, as I said earlier, I'm interested in word and image through using AI. So I'll just have to do a super quick race. On the left-hand side of these pairs are drawings that I made that are sort of intentionally abstract, but look a little bit like maybe letters, maybe glyphs. And then I sort of asked an AI what it sees in the image. And then I asked the AI which specific bits of the image made it give that answer. And so on the right-hand side, what you see are the parts of my drawing that sort of yielded that specific answer, isolated. So this one's scorpion, for instance. And that was obviously interesting to sort of reveal these things about AI, but also it was about my interest in how we construct meaning and how we look at images, and when we see an image with a word underneath, we immediately make connections, and how we read meaning into images in that way. So essentially, if you want to make work about individuals or about culture or about anthropology or about society, then work with AI, and it will give you that. So finally, a very quick well, that's my call to action, but a very quick diversity throwback. I should say that there are many levels at which you can work with AI, and I think I've made that clear with some of my examples. You don't even need to know how to code. That said, the more you learn, then the more knowledge you have and the more flexibility and power you have. And if you're going to break the tool, you probably want to know as much as possible how it works. So again, we're in the right place for me to be saying that today. But with so many directions to go in, and thinking back to my example with paint, such a simple substance, and yet so many different ways to use it and test it and create new things with it. There are so many different directions to go in with how you're all going to go off and work with AI now, that I think the most important thing to remember is criticality, and that should be your guide in which way you develop or where you want to go to. Because it's no good learning how to do any of these things. As we know, the idea of the sort of purely technical perspective is a fallacy anyway, that the critical perspective has to be your guide. And I will end there. Thank you very much.